Welcome back, everybody, and we're on to our second week. We've had our intro week, and I very much appreciate everybody's essays that first week. It really helped me understand how you form arguments, and I have to say that I was extremely pleased, not just with the quality of work, which I kind of expected, but the quality of interaction between people. I know that several of you disagreed with the points others made. In some cases, I jumped in to disagree with you if nobody else would, even if I agreed with you in principle. I thought that you should get a dose of, the devil's advocate, as we call it. But I was extremely pleased with the way people came back and said, I see your point, but, or, here's another way of looking at it. I think that really showed a great academic maturity from everybody in this course. So it really makes me feel great about moving on. So this week we're going to talk about law in very general terms. There's going to be a lot of review from what you had, a lot of it from law and ethics in the workplace, but it's been a long time from that course for a number of you, so we're going to review that, but we're also going to put a twist on the review and talk about how we look at things through a security lens. So many people will ask, why do we review? We already know this stuff. Well, again, for some of you, it's been a little while. You're in your fourth year, and some of you took law and ethics in the workplace in your first year. I don't know about you. Maybe it's just my advancing age, but I have a little trouble remembering. Well, I can't say that I had the same thing for breakfast every morning, but if I didn't, I wouldn't remember one day to the next. And, we're talking about 3-4 years ago for some, so it's worthwhile to review. The terms that we use, and especially the way we use our lens to look at this as a security manager, is a little different than what you've had before. So we're kind of reviewing some things, but we're looking at them from that different perspective, right? Terms that we use are really critical in this space because, law is a language in and of itself. So there'll be some terms that we just want to, refresh your memory on so we're sure we're using them all correctly. And then realistically, I say no student left behind. You're all juniors, seniors for the most part. I'm certainly not going to dumb the course down. But again, if we all start on the same footing with a review, then I would expect we all have the same opportunity to excel in the end. So that's what we're going to do this week. So we're going to look at terms. We're going to look at the relevance of those terms and those concepts to the security manager, and then where applicable and where it might helpful. I'll give you some examples, both fictional and real-world examples of how these things may fit into that security management perspective. So what are laws? And this definition should look familiar to you. Laws are a set of enforceable rules that govern relationships between individuals and between individuals and their government. And there is a big difference in those two. And you will find that many laws that you think and rights that you think you have really only protect you from government. And so it'd be interesting as we go along, people believe they have the right to remain silent. Well, that is in questioning with the government, right? Unlawful searches and seizures say that the government cannot do certain things. So we have to consider that laws are both between individuals, relationships between individuals, and between individuals and their government. Laws maintain stability. Can you imagine if the law changed from one room to the next on our campus? It would just simply be too complex. So law actually, as complex as it is, does add stability and thus some ease in complexity in the long run. It also permits change. We have laws, and laws change frequently, quite honestly. You don't see it. It appears to be moving very slow because there's just so many of them. But laws really change every day based on case law, based on different administrative rules being changed, those types of things. The law changes an awful lot, and our laws permit that through a process. They're made through legislation, but they get modified quite a bit by administrative actions and by court interpretations. When you think about laws on collecting taxes, and I'll use that one a lot because I think it's a very clear-cut one, the Constitution gives the government the authority to levy and collect taxes. Now, an administrative action tells us that the IRS is the arm of the government which will do that, and they tell us that we must file a certain form once per year to show and to true up, if you will, our tax bill based on various tax laws. But the real law on taxation comes from the Constitution, right? The government has the right to levy and collect taxes. Administrative actions tell us that you must file your tax return on the 15th of April. There's nothing really in the Constitution that says that. It's not mentioned at all as a date. But administrative laws tell us that's when it must be done. And then courts have interpreted it to say when you can get an extension of that, or why that may not be possible. When people have violated the law, been arrested for it, or been called in by the IRS, they have filed court cases to say, but there is an extenuating circumstance, and then the court will set that circumstance, and that becomes then a precedent. So laws are formed all over, right? Administrative laws become a really significant thing for security managers simply because we fall under a lot of regulations, especially now from DHS, FDA, USDA, gosh, you name it. There's a government organization that puts a regulation, if you will, on security these days. And so these are administrative laws and rules that we must obey, and a lot of them come from that rather than from criminal law, which most people have become I'll call them pseudo-experts, but reasonably well-informed on criminal law. But very few people have experience with administrative laws and the nuances of them, and we'll talk a fair amount about that. And then, of course, case law is made by court interpretation. We'll study a fairly significant number of court cases this term, and you'll see how someone challenging the law, the applicability of the law, more so than the validity. In most of these cases, people are saying, I don't challenge the fact that we need that law. I'm challenging that this law applies in this way to me. And we will find that courts in some cases agree or modify the law in some way, and then that becomes the new law and the new way we need to look at it as a security manager. And as we read legal cases this term, you will find that case law will definitely impact the way you go about your practice. Again, a review. But what are the purposes of law? Well, to keep the peace, obviously. If you didn't have laws, you would have anarchy, and we do need a certain number of laws. It can be argued, and I would not necessarily disagree, that we have far too many laws. I had a professor many years ago who called some laws pseudo-laws. They're not really laws. They're just, things that people have thrown out there because of one time something happened and we felt like we needed to throw a law at it, and it did more harm than good. But laws generally keep the peace. There's a law against murder, and if there were not laws against murder, we would probably have more murders. If there wasn't a penalty for murder, I would think that some road rage incidents would turn into murder more so than they do today. They shape moral standards. Basically, we understand that we must do certain things in a certain way because the law tells us to do that, and then that becomes part of our normal day-to-day and the way we act, and it forms our behavior. Laws promote social justice because laws are generally applicable to everyone equally. Certainly, some administrative law does not do that. It sometimes classifies people, and there's some imbalance there, and we can certainly talk about that. But generally speaking, especially the criminal law, it may not be applied equally to everyone, but it does apply, right? So it may not be... the penalties may differ, right, based on social standing. We have seen that. That's an argument that's happening today. However, the law itself doesn't say that should happen that way. It's more the application than it is the law itself. But laws themselves, the way they're written, promote social justice. They all allow us to keep things the same. We kind of know when we go from room to room, the law will be the same. But they also allow for the orderly change, right? So if we find a law is bad, or circumstances change, or we decide something is no longer harmful to us, and we decide to change the law, there's an orderly way to do that. They provide a basis for compromise, and this is normally in the civil matters. As you know, many cases are compromised, right? They're decided by an agreement, a settlement, if you will. They facilitate planning, and can you imagine if you didn't know what the laws were, how would you plan to even take a trip somewhere? I'm going to go from here and I'm in Michigan, I'm going to go to Ohio. Do I know if cars are allowed in Ohio? Well, of course I do. There's no law against cars. Do I know if my driver's license is going to work? Well, yeah, I do know that it will work. Without the laws, I couldn't plan at all. But they maximize individual freedom. And although there are many laws which restrict us, for the most part, they restrict us in an orderly way and allow us to go about doing our business until we violate the law. They tell us what's wrong, not what's right. So if it doesn't tell us something's wrong, then in essence, we cannot be held accountable for it if we do it in a different way. So it does maximize individual freedom, at least in theory. But let's now not look at laws generally. Let's look at them as if we're a security manager. Well, if laws are meant to keep the peace, then I would think of that as a security manager. What laws keep the peace in my realm? Well, one of the things as a security manager I'm tasked with is keeping bad guys out of my workplace. So trespassing laws will definitely be something that helps keep the peace in my realm and through my lens. Also, laws on protests and interruption of business. We have this in my workplace today. We've just came out with a vaccine for COVID, and there are some issues in some parts of the world with distribution, which unfortunately we can't control. But the company has incurred some protests and some threats from people who want to interrupt our business, which makes kind of no sense. Let's interrupt the flow of the vaccine so we can get more vaccine. I'm not so sure I see the logic there, but they have threatened to interrupt the business. There are laws that protect us from allowing people to interrupt our business. And so from my lens, keeping the peace means I can make sure somebody can't block the entryway to my factories where I'm going to make that vaccine for the public good because they're protesting, because the law will protect me from that. Certainly workplace conduct is shaped by the morals and standards created by law. Again, because laws don't change when we go from room to room, house to house. They do slightly from city to city, right? Those are little nuances, but for the most part, the laws don't change that much from one jurisdiction to another within the United States. And we know that you can't punch somebody in the nose because you feel like it. You can't rape, rob, and pillage. Workplace conduct then is an offshoot of normal social conduct. The laws certainly promote social justice in equal treatment. And in the workplace, that may mean equal treatment in investigation, in access to facilities, employment in your own department. You can't discriminate in an investigation. Those who have taken my investigations, of course, know we have tests of just cause for firing. All of those keep things on a level playing field to promote social justice in a way that there is equality in the workplace. Maintaining the status quo is a little tricky on our side because a person's rights don't change when they enter the workplace unless they agree to it, and oftentimes they do. So, for instance, when you take a job, and people will sign anything on the first day of a new job, you get a stack of forms and you're very excited, right? You've got an income and hopefully it's better than your last income. You've got some benefits. You have gainful employment from which you can enjoy certain things in life. And then the employer slides 10 pages across from you and says, you need to sign these forms. And I don't know very many people who read those forms critically before they sign every one of them. You don't want to seem like the person who is going to try to litigate every word on your first day, even before you started the job. But we do sometimes sign away certain rights when we enter the workplace. One prime example is a non-compete agreement. We should be able to go from one job to the next and do so freely, as long as the next person will hire us. If they want to pay us more to do something, great, we go and we take the next job. But in some fields and at some levels, you sign a non-compete agreement saying that you won't go to work for a competitor of your employer for a certain time period, normally 2 years, 3 years, after you leave that employer. So if you're an employee of American Airlines and you sign a non-compete, it may say that for the next 2 years you won't go to work for Delta or United. You may agree to arbitration rather than a suit against your employer. You may agree that if you get hurt in the workplace, you won't sue the employer, you will go to arbitration. We can sign away our rights in the workplace. And so the status quo may change, and that's an important thing for a security manager to know. The facilitating of orderly change is really important in our field because when regulations change and say you must do things in a certain way, if it weren't for laws and the amount of time it takes for a law to change, then you would never know it, and they would say, well, tomorrow you need to do it this way. You can no longer have armed security guards in a retail establishment, let's say. Law comes out and it bans armed security guards in a retail establishment. And you are the security manager of a retail establishment in a bad neighborhood, and you have a history of break-ins and a history of armed robberies, and you're dealing in diamonds and gold. Well, if the law just changed overnight and you found out about it, you've got a problem. But the slow change and the facilitating of orderly change built into our laws allows us then to say, okay, well, we moved the store or we moved the gold and diamonds, and we use pictures to sell stuff and we send it in when we need it. A lot of things we can do to change, but it's slow. Again, through the civil law, we have a basis for compromise. And that's also through criminal law. If you are charged with a crime, you may decide to take a plea. A plea agreement just says that rather than plead guilty to, or if I plead guilty to this particular crime, I will do a lesser penalty. I will agree to plead guilty for a lesser penalty, or I will agree to a lesser charge. Or in a lawsuit, rather than go ahead with the lawsuit and go through the trial, I want $1 million from you, but I will take $500,000 and we won't have to go to trial. There is a basis for compromise built into the law. And from a security manager's standpoint, lawsuits are a big concern. And oftentimes, I mean, in your career, you will be involved as a witness or to provide information in a lawsuit, and that will make a difference as to whether the company settles or goes through with the suit. You also have the compromise of, as a victim, suppose you're the security manager and you catch someone stealing from you, you don't have to call the police and have that person arrested. You can simply compromise and say, I'm going to fire this person and remove them from my workplace and be done with the matter and accept the loss or get a return of the item. But you have the ability to compromise and not necessarily file charges in that particular matter. These two purposes, facilitating planning, certainly if we did not know what the law required, we could not plan our physical, procedural, and personnel security programs. We know that in a particular town, we can have a fence that is no more than 4 feet tall. And when we plan a physical security plan for for a particular facility in that town, if we know we need a fence, if it can only be 4 feet tall, we better have a second plan, right? How tall can a wall be? Can I use, holly as hedges, which is very hard to climb, and you get stuck pretty good? Can I use barbed wire instead of the 4-foot fence? Can I use 4-foot rolled concertina barbed wire? If you know what the law is, you can plan, especially around the physical side, but also personnel and procedural side as well. If the law is consistent, you can plan around it. And then again, maximizing individual freedom. You can plan around the rights when you know they're consistent. If you know that you can't unlawfully detain someone, right? The law says that you can't detain someone as a private citizen, and you are in retail loss prevention. You know that you can't lock somebody in a room until the police come, right? The rights are there. You know what they are. Therefore, you can build a program around them that protects and maximizes individual freedoms. So what does this all mean for you as a security manager? Well, laws give us certain rights to protect our workplace, the people, property, resources, and reputation that we're paid to protect. We have certain rights to be able to do that, right? We can control who comes into our property because there are trespass laws. We can potentially fire someone if we find wrongdoing rather than have them arrested because we have that right to compromise. Workplace conduct is generally derived from the applicable laws, right? But there is no company policy that I'm aware of where I work, and we have a lot of policies, and I can't think of anybody that has a policy that says you're not allowed to murder in the workplace. We certainly have a workplace violence policy. It says no weapons. Any time that you try to harm another person, you can be fired, but it doesn't specifically say you can't murder somebody because we don't need that because we've derived that conduct from the applicable law. And rights don't go away when people enter the workplace, but people can agree to waive their rights, and they often do, especially in that initial hiring. Another great example of that is background checks. I can't run a background check on you. I mean, I can go to normal social media and look at public postings that you do and things that are in the public domain. Convictions in some states are public, in other states they're not. But I can't effectively run a background check on you without you agreeing to that, right? But when you take a new job, you normally sign and say, go ahead and do a background check on me. You've waived those rights in agreement. And as a security manager, that's important for me to know that now I have the right to do that because you've agreed to that waiver. So as a security manager, we also understand that the law gives us time. And that's a huge concept, is that it gives us time. Laws change so slowly, and they are normally so public in change, especially within a discipline, that you can react from a business standpoint to shift your priorities, your policies, your procedures, and you can do it in an orderly way. For instance, there was, before the legalization of marijuana in my home state of Michigan, there was probably a year and a half of 2 years of debate of, how things would go on a ballot, polls being taken about how people would feel, how legislators would vote, what they would do to stand in the way of it or to push it through. And there were a number of people who were in the retail marijuana business in other states that looked at that very carefully to say, should we make an investment in storefronts in Michigan? Should we start to set territories? Should we start to try to push competition out so we can get our business in? Without that time, if we're just overnight, all of a sudden, boom, it's legal here, there would have been a free-for-all. And a lot of businesses that would have been set up would have had a hard time doing so because there probably would have been 1,000 applicants for licenses. So laws give us time, and that is hugely important, that especially changes in law as a security manager, you want that time to react and to shift your priorities. Civil laws that compromise. We can choose whether we are a victim in most cases. Certainly if you come across, and you will come across as a security manager, and you will do it frequently, unfortunately, you will come across illegal child pornography in the workplace. And the reason is that people who have that proclivity a lot of times will not do it at home because they have others that may find out at home and they think they have more anonymity at work. They normally do not. And you will come across that. In that case, you have a legal requirement to report because you really aren't the victim in that case. But if you are a victim of a theft or an embezzlement, you as a business make that decision. You have that right to compromise to decide whether you want to have that person arrested, which in some cases you do. In others, you just cut your losses and you let them go. In some cases, you do that. But you have that right to do that as a security manager. And you also need to understand, respect the individual rights unless the holder expressly waives those rights. And even when they waive those rights, you have to be very careful that they won't come back and say that they were misled in some way about what they signed. It always comes back to haunt you on those. But very clearly, something that a security manager really makes a lot of their decisions based on are what rights the person has retained and what they have waived in the workplace. So administrative law is something that people just, it's there because you obey it every day, but sometimes you just don't think of it as administrative law. And those are rules that are made, and they're normally the process and procedure of obeying a higher level law. So again, let's look at our example of taxes. The Constitution allows taxes. Legislation allows taxing of income. There's nothing in the Constitution that says anything about income tax. It says leveling of and collecting of taxes. Legislation allows for the taxing of income. And then there's administrative rules and laws that say you have to file a tax return every year. That's kind of the hierarchy of how laws are enacted, and then the procedures and policies for carrying them out. And there are a lot of administrative laws and rules that tie in to your job as a security manager. Let's just look at a couple of them because we're going to do a whole unit on administrative law, but I just want to throw some of them out there because there are just so many, and you really need to keep in tune with those, especially those that relate to your specialty in security. So there are a whole lot of administrative laws around the movement of dangerous goods. And most people, when they think movement of dangerous goods, they think safety laws, but a lot of them have to do with Homeland Security regulations now. Maritime laws. If you have a business that is situated on a navigable, I can't say that word, navigable waterway, then you have certain requirements, especially if you have certain products. There is a section of the Mississippi River around Missouri where there are a number of chemical plants that sit on the water. They need the water source, realistically, and they move raw materials up and down the river. They have certain security requirements that you would not have had that factory been placed somewhere else. And part of that is to protect the waterways, and part of it's to protect against terrorism. But there are certain maritime laws that security managers need to be aware of. A lot of anti-terrorism laws. Imputable income is an administrative law that security managers have to be concerned with because oftentimes you are doing home security. So for instance, I have executives who have home security systems that I provide in their home. camera system that I may monitor for them, an alarm system that may go to the police and back to a monitoring station that I run, so that I can protect high-level executives, especially those who, if compromised, might affect the stock price, right? That's why we do it. It's not because we're nice. It's not because they're any better than you, but because if the CEO of a company gets kidnapped, it could drive the price of the stock down, because they see that as a major disruption and potential change in the direction of the company if something were to happen to him and someone else came in. And so we put protection on that person. However, they must pay the tax on those systems and things that they use. You see the executive on the corporate jet, and when he's going from a business meeting in one city to the next, that's a business reason to use the jet. In many cases, they're allowed to use that jet to take their family out to Vail for the weekend. And it may be in their contract that the company pays for that jet. But the amount of money that would normally cost for a chartered jet is considered income, and tax is due on that. And as a security manager, when you provide any kind of protection for executives, you have to be concerned about imputed income and make sure that they know that, because there's nothing worse than an executive who gets the tax bill on a flight to China and no one told them about it, right? Or you put a full-blown security system and a couple bodyguards on their personal property and then explain to them that although you're paying the salary of those guards, the actual bill comes to about $1 million a year, and they have to pay the income tax on that because it's considered to be a form of income. Things like international trafficking in arms laws, you'd be surprised at the things that soldiers cannot go to war without. So if you are in a company that happens to make canteens, well, that canteen, if it's used in a military purpose, may be covered by ITAR. And therefore, you have a whole lot of laws about what you can and can't do in the factory where you're making that canteen. And I don't know if canteens are covered under ITAR, but it's just an example. I know that atropine pens for nerve agents are certainly a munition, anything that you would not go to war without can be covered by that regulation. Customs and trade partnerships against terrorism. If you ship tangible goods on passenger aircraft, you can work with customs and set up a screening area inside of your factory so that when things are set to go out on that passenger aircraft, they've already been screened. They've already been x-rayed. They've already been sealed. And you put them into a certified carrier. They take it to the airport, and it doesn't have to get screened again before it goes on the plane. But if you do that wrong, you're going to pay a healthy fine, and then you get that right taken away, and then your stuff goes to the airport, and it sits in customs with everybody else's stuff, and it's going to be 3 or 4 more days till it gets to the customer. In some cases, you'll lose a customer. But those are administrative laws that cover the transportation of public goods on passenger aircraft. Administrative laws are plentiful. There are so many of them, and they have the most impact on full compliance for a security manager compared to criminal law and other laws. You really need to think about the specialty that you have in security, be it supply chain or, in my case, pharmaceuticals and medical devices, or oil refining, security for the oil refining business. I mean, nuclear, every one of them has their own set of administrative laws and rules that as a security manager really impact what you do. So it's important stuff in our lens to look at those laws. So let's get back a little bit. Let me get my squares there. Okay. Let's get back a little bit to some of the terms. The Commerce Clause. You have all heard in another class about the Commerce Clause. Commerce Clause of the Constitution basically says that the federal government has unlimited control over all business transactions, including interstate commerce that crosses state borders and intrastate commerce that affects interstate commerce. That's a mouthful. Interstate commerce is just that. It is interstate, things that move from one state to another. And intrastate are things that move within a state, but that may still affect other states. So let's think about a couple of examples here. A driver's license. So a driver's license is covered under the full faith and credit of the U.S. government. And so when I drive from Michigan to visit you in Pennsylvania, I know that when I go through Ohio, my driver's license is good, and it's still good in Pennsylvania, that a driver's license in one state, when issued by one state, is valid in the other, even when the requirements to get one may be different from one state to another. Can you think of any worse thing in the world than leaving Michigan, having to drive south through Indiana and around through, I guess you'd be at Kentucky then, and come back up through West Virginia and then get over to Pennsylvania, simply because the state of Ohio said we don't respect Michigan driver's license? Commerce Clause allows the government to make a stipulation that licenses will be valid in all states. Now, if you think about helmet laws, they are state controlled. So if I ride a motorcycle from Michigan through Ohio to get to Pennsylvania, the state of Michigan doesn't require helmets anymore. They used to, but they don't anymore. I don't know if Ohio does or not. I'm not a motorcycle rider, so I apologize for not knowing that one. But if they did require them, when I got to the border, I'd have to put on a helmet. And then if Pennsylvania didn't require them, I could take them off again when I crossed over in Erie, right? There are some laws that are state controlled, and they are intrastate within the state. While I'm there, I have to know that. Now, think about if I run a courier business. I'm going to run actual signed legal documents that can't be scanned and sent electronically. They need to be moved from place to place, right? I'm going to transport those from Michigan to Pennsylvania, and I'm going to do it by motorcycle because it's the cheapest way to do it. They're just documents. They're light. I can put them in a pack on the bike, and I can take them. I don't have to worry about the cost of anything. I'm going to do motorcycle carrier. When I get to the border, I have to then be concerned with, do I wear a helmet? And in some states, there are security rules that when you move from state to state, they change. Now, the one example to this that I think is kind of different, and it's something that's testing the whole Commerce Clause, in my opinion, are the marijuana laws now, because there's so much gray in that. Marijuana is a Schedule I drug, according to the Drug Enforcement Administration and the U.S. government. It has no known medicinal use. Now, there are studies that show that in some cases it may have medicinal use, but a Schedule I, some people look at the schedule of drugs, Schedule I, Schedule II are things like heroin and fentanyl. Sometimes they look at it as, why is fentanyl, which we know can be dangerous, a Schedule II, and marijuana is Schedule I? Well, it's based on the use. And Schedule I simply means that it is considered to be a drug that has no known medical and proven medical use. It's legal to possess it, though, in many places. It's either decriminalized or perfectly legal in many places. But dispensers can't use banks to hold their money when they sell. They have to put it in a safe or use other means to protect their money because of interstate banking laws, because those are controlled by federal laws. So the Commerce Clause is somewhat under attack right now by the federal government having one set of rules about marijuana, states and localities having another, and then banking laws being controlled by the Fed. I think it's a really great, for those of you who are legal junkies, I think watching how the Commerce Clause is going to interpret marijuana laws. I don't think we can go on like we do forever. The more money coming into marijuana trade in states, which is happening now, means more money coming into these dispensaries and thus into major corporations, and not having a way for them to put their money in the bank then becomes somewhat of a cash business in many cases, which is hard to tax. And so I think governments are going to pressure the federal government to make changes. But nonetheless, the Commerce Clause is something as a security manager you have to consider, because there could be differences in the way your products, especially if you have tangible commodities, which can be touched, right, an actual product, move from state to state. And the reason this is all as it is with the Commerce Clause is that states have the power to regulate business activity within their borders. Those are their police powers. They can enact laws to promote public health and safety and morals, as long as the law does not unduly burden interstate commerce. That is, again, where that marijuana example is going to come into play because of the banking being interstate commerce. The public law about legalization is impacting interstate commerce. But states can generally add restrictions to federal law, but they normally don't remove them. Again, in this case, we see a removal. But generally speaking, states can add things to federal law to make their own local health, safety, and moral general welfare stipulations within a law. And as a security manager, you can assume that something's legal in one place and not in another. This is particularly true if you're interpreting background checks, because you may find that one person has an arrest for something and another person did the exact same thing but in another jurisdiction, and it's not illegal. So you have to understand background checks a little bit. The joke I use is that it may be illegal in Kalamazoo and show up on your record, and it's just a hobby in New York City. But where you commit the crime makes a difference on whether or not it shows on a background check. As a security manager, and if you have input into hiring and looking at background checks, you have to make a determination whether something that is relatively minor on a background check that wouldn't have been on the check in the place the person's going to work. So, for instance, you're taking a job in New York City and you are arrested for something, a morals clause charge of some kind. Let me put it in a better example. You're going to take a job in Las Vegas where prostitution is generally legal, but you are arrested for soliciting prostitution in Pennsylvania. Should that affect your job in Las Vegas where that is legal? As a security manager, you may have significant input into interpreting background checks and understanding those nuances with different charges. So states can add restrictions to federal governments. They generally cannot remove them. And as a security manager, you need to know what may have been added by a state or a locality and showing on a person's record. So, another great example of this is in trailers. In the state of Michigan, you cannot pull a double tractor trailer. You can't have a double box, right? A truck and one trailer. I know in Ohio, you could pull actually a triple. They have to be smaller, but a triple trailer. I think in Pennsylvania, I'm not mistaken, but I think maybe until recently, you could pull 2 trailers behind a truck. You could pull a double, right? If you are securing those things and you're moving from state to state, what about the route that things must take? If you have a double trailer in Pennsylvania, it's okay when it gets into Ohio where even a triple trailer is allowed, but then if it has to go through Michigan, you may have to change the route of your travel. Will that mean that your truck is now going to have to go, in this case, if you avoided the state of Michigan, you would go through Indiana and potentially through the Chicago area, which has one of the highest rates of cargo theft in the country, Chicago and Miami being the 2 hotbeds of cargo theft. In fact, North Chicago near O'Hare and Miami near the port are the highest in truck hijackings in the U.S. And as a security manager, you'd have to understand whether or not that law, that simple law about how many trailers you can pull behind a truck, will affect the security of the things in the truck. And also the value. You generally have a certain value you will put into a truck. If that truck gets hijacked and it has $10 million worth of goods in it, that's a major loss. If it has $100 million worth of goods in it, that's a fireable offense. You are not going to keep your job that day. So there are normally limits. Well, if trucks are going to couple and decouple, and there's going to be some transportation tricks along the way, as a security manager, you're going to need to understand that, because you may double your potential loss just from the trucking routes and just from the law that says that trailers can be different. So you need to understand those intra and intrastate rules, and even if there are local nuances to those, there may be different laws between counties on things that you probably want to be aware of when it comes to security and how they may affect it. And then, of course, we add in the international factor. If you're in a global position as I am, there are many things you can and cannot do. I can monitor cameras from my house in China. If I want to pop up on my cell phone and look at a factory in China somewhere, I can just pop that up and I can take a look at it, right? I've got the technology set and I can do that. However, I can't do that from Germany. It's not the technology, but in Germany, you cannot move video from one place to another outside of country without specific permissions from the people who are being videoed. So I can't watch that German factory, even though it's no different than the Chinese one except from its location. So the international factor also comes into play in that. And freedom of speech. Right? We all, know that you have freedom of speech, but you can't just say anything. There's a time and a place. The old test is you can't yell fire in a crowded theater as a point of freedom of speech. That would be not protected, right? But can an employer fire somebody for speaking their mind at work? How about outside of work? People tend to think that they have the absolute right to speak about their employer on social media, when in many cases they have waived that right. They have said that they will abide by company policies on social media, and that's all they have to say. And then the company comes out with a policy on social media that says you may not speak ill of us Or if you speak about the company in any way, you must have a disclaimer that says, this is my opinion and not that of the company. So, the freedom of speech is very much curtailed by employers these days, and often done so with your own permission by things that you have signed when you came onto the job. Also, things like union collective bargaining speech. They are protected. And in fact, the employer cannot stop you from having discussions with others about potentially unionizing in a workplace as long as you are eligible to do so, right? You're not management employees. They can't stop you from doing that. However, they can stop the time of day that you do it. They can say that you can only do it during certain times of day, like breaks, right? You can't stop work in order to do that. But again, your freedom of speech is, in that case, enhanced if you decide to do that, except if you do it wrong. Freedom of speech gets really, really complex. And we are hired to protect the employer. But I think security managers would be well advised to understand their company's social media policies. In an investigation, normally you come across, when in any serious investigation I've done in the last, say, 10 years, there's been some form of social media spin to the thing. Something's been done on Facebook or Twitter or some other platform that adds or doesn't add to the case. And you need to understand what your company's policies and rules are about social media versus freedom of speech. The person could claim, I can say whatever I want on Facebook, but you need to understand in context whether or not they have waived that right. And finally, we get to due process. And we all know that due process is simply a way to say fairness before you are sentenced, if you will, based on a misdeed, right? You have the right to face your accuser. You have the right to defend yourself. Due process applies to charges brought by the government, okay? Procedural due process is available to any citizen before the government can take life, liberty, property. The government has to give notice and a fair hearing. Not all businesses need to do that. Due process is not the standard, right? When someone is fired from a job, a court cannot say this person did not receive due process. And in fact, in many states where you are an employee at will, the employer has the right to fire you for no reason, and you have the right to leave the job without giving a reason. It is considered to be a two-way street, although I would suggest that no one ever said you couldn't leave the job without a reason. Most employers will say, well, that's terrible, and I'll give you a bad reference, but you have the right to do that. No one's ever challenged that. But certainly, at-will employment means that the employer can simply say, I'm sorry, Brian, but we don't have a position for you anymore. Pack your things and leave. There's also probationary agreements. You agree to be a probationary employee for 6 months, perhaps, and that is in those packets of things you sign when you come in, right? There is no requirement then for the company to do anything, even if you're not at will. If you've waived the right to any kind of process, then they say, I'm sorry, your probation's up and we've decided not to keep you. And it may not be for your own performance, and maybe they just don't have a job for you anymore. But businesses don't have the same due process. And as a security manager, you have to understand that. However, you also have to understand what your company uses as a standard instead of due process. Those of you who have taken my investigations course, you understand the 7 tests of just cause, which is a kind of a common standard, although it's not a legal requirement. But it basically asks, did you do a fair investigation? Did you interview the person? There's a list of 7 things that employers should abide by when they do an investigation or when they just release an employee in a non-at-will environment to make sure that they're covered from a civil perspective, they didn't violate someone's rights. But it's not the same as due process with government. And employees get confused on that. You can't fire me. You didn't investigate me. You can't prove that I did it, so you can't fire me, is a non-starter in most businesses. You can indeed have someone fired for the suspicion of something if it is strong enough and if it is disruptive enough. You may get sued, but in most cases you would not lose because due process applies to government. So the term due process, as you studied it in law before, is important. It's an important concept for all citizens so that the government cannot treat you unfairly. You have the right to face your accused and to have a trial if you are accused of something. But in business, you don't have those rights. And the security manager has to understand due process in the context of our lens is simply trying to do what's fair, but you're not hamstringed by the same level that the government is. So just a real quick couple of things here before we close up. Reading legal cases. I know that in my investigations class and in security management class, I have had students say that they thought that was the toughest part of the class and they didn't enjoy reading legal cases. I just can't even relate to that because I really do enjoy reading legal cases. What you're really reading are decisions of courts. You're not reading the whole case. And the decision is dense. There's a lot of information in them because it's a recap of potentially thousands of pages of testimony and artifacts and other documentation. And it has to recap everything that happened in that trial and then tell why the court decided as it did, whether the person, owed someone money or had to reinstate somebody or whether the person's rights were violated. Decision is a very dense thing. I think that's one of the hardest parts of it is there's a lot of information condensed in a very short document normally. I have found that using a name code is something that helps me. There are normally a lot of names in those documents. Mr. Jones did this to Mr. Smith, and Mr. Brown witnessed this happening to Mr. Jones because they name the names over and over again for clarity. However, you get to about paragraph 3 and you forget which one is Jones and which one is Brown. Take notes on these things and name them A, B, and C. Jones is always A. This guy's always B. If you do that in your notes, you'll be able to follow the bouncing ball, if you will, in the story. These really are stories, okay? And you're just trying to make a connection between the case facts that they're going to recap for you and then their final conclusion, why they said that the outcome should be this. And if you just change the names to letters, I think that is one of the easiest things to do. Because A always becomes A in your mind. It doesn't matter whether his name is Smith, Jones, Rabinowitz, or Wisniewski. It doesn't matter, right? You can follow the bouncing ball better if you just do that. And if reading legal cases gives you grief, just say A, found that, was fired from his job. B saw him steal something. C confirmed that B was there and likely saw A steal something. I can follow that better than Jones, Brown, and Smith because I won't get them confused as much, right? You just take notes that way and change the names. It's just a simple way to do it. I've known a number of people who've done it, and it keeps me straight when I read them. So use it for what you will. Look for precedent. You will find that in a lot of court cases, precedent will be used. So the court finds that Jones did steal something and that the company, ABC company, had every right to fire them, and they had evidence. However, they fired him and held back his pay, and they'll name another case. Black versus Butler County School District. Butler County School District did the same thing, and that court found that you can't withhold pay from somebody when you fire them for a terminatable offense like stealing. It wasn't an at-will place, but you found that they stole something, and you terminated them, and you decided to hold back their pay, unless you could correlate that pay perhaps with the value of the thing stolen for reimbursement. So they'll use precedent. Look for precedent in other cases, because if you have a question, you can always go to the other case. It's kind of like, but you got to be careful when you follow that rabbit hole. There's always going to be precedent. But in some cases, the court's just going to say, we found this way because some other court found that way, and so that part's already been decided. So when you're reading court cases, they'll say, well, this court found this way, so we're accepting that. So that's a fact. We're solving this matter because some other court's already decided it for us. And then we looked at this part of the case, and the guy said that I stole it, but it didn't have any value. That's why I took it. Therefore, he didn't think it had value, and he doesn't agree they should hold his pay back because there's no value to him, and they can't prove the value. Well, then another court found that that's illegal to do, so that part's decided. And in many cases, they piece together precedent and only find on one very narrow range, which becomes their little piece of precedent. So if you're having trouble reading court cases, read them slowly. Let me know. We're going to do a number of Zoom meetings when the court cases start, and we can have a little discussion group if you like on the case. If you're really not getting it, you can come in and maybe others can help straighten them out for you. So laws being an offshoot of social norms, generally accepted behaviors, protective measures, checks on fairness, they become the basis for your security program. Your security program is really based on the laws around you. Therefore, it's good to understand the very specific laws that come with security so that you can use those as a basis for your program. They provide stability and they give you time to adapt. If it weren't for laws, changes would come so quick that we couldn't keep up with them. Just as we know, when laws change, a lot of times they'll give you the time to come into compliance. But if not, you know things are coming. That's the great thing about laws. They give you an indication of what's coming. Employees often waive rights, and they normally do so as a condition of employment. In fact, I've waived rights in certain things and not in others in my own employment. Free speech is a great example. You're not yelling fire in a burning building if you say the company is unfair to female workers. But you may have signed something saying you're not going to do that in social media without first writing a disclaimer that's saying this is your opinion and it does not reflect the opinion or the feeling of the company. That may be a rule that you've agreed to. And so even though you have the free speech right to say that, you may have, as an employee, given up some of your rights when you took on the employment. As a security manager, you need to understand what rights have been waived and which have been retained. The great thing about law is it gives you parameters. You understand that you are no bigger than the law as the security manager, even within your confines. So you must operate within it. You have to uphold the law like every other citizen, but you need to understand it so you know what your rights are and what rights have been potentially waived by others. Laws allow for compromise, and that is a huge thing for a security manager to consider, especially in investigations. When you find someone who has broken the law, you have to determine who the victim is. If the company is the victim, then the company decides whether or not they want to file a complaint, right? When someone hits you in the face, you may go to the police department and file a complaint for assault. If someone steals from a company, the company makes the decision whether they go to the police department at all. Because as a victim, you have the right to simply compromise and say, I don't want to do that. And you have other things as a company at your disposal, like firing the person, right? Giving them a bad reference if possible. Compromise is a big part in law and a big part for a security manager. Remember the Commerce Clause in intra and interstate commerce, because regulations change as your products that you are protecting potentially move from place to place. And then also remember that administrative laws in the field of security are plentiful. There are many, and we're going to do a whole unit on just some of them, just to touch base on some of those that are more prevalent than others. But as a security manager, you have to understand the administrative laws that affect the type of products or business that you have. And in the discussion this week, you're kind of going to make some linkages on that. So this week, what do you have to do? You're going to do some reading. You're going to read the intro to our book. Now, I would suggest, and for those who, cut the lecture short because they didn't want to watch the whole thing, they won't know this, and they may have to, learn the hardware. But read just to page 32. You can skim the rest of it. Now, if you really are into the book, and I think that actually some of it's very, very interesting, you can read it. You don't have to skim it, but read to page 32, just where it transitions into some terminology like causation, I think is the first one on 32 or 33. Just read up until then because it gives you the background that you'll need. And then the others, there's some terms in there and some other things. You can skim it after that. I'd like you to take a look at it to the end. The introduction is about 60 pages. It's a little dry in some places, but up to page 32 I think is important for you to understand for context. After that, you can skim it. The lecture is done. Thank you. This is the end of it. The slides are available to you for note-taking. Hopefully you printed those out and took some notes, or at least had them on another screen, or had screen off to the side where you could take notes on it. I don't protect that, so you can actually take notes on it. We have a discussion due this week. Your initial post is due Wednesday at midnight. If you don't turn in an initial post, you can get no more than 2 points of the available 5 for this discussion. 3 points on the initial, 2 on the responses. You have 2 responses due. The initial post needs to be, I think, 200 words is what I put in there. I think you'll probably come closer to 250 to 300. Don't try to count words. Just try to write the thing. And I think if you write it and you actually develop the topic and do the paragraphs as you're instructed, you're going to come out right around the right number. Don't worry if it goes too long, although try not to write War and Peace. But look, 200 words is minimum. And I think that realistically, you'll end up at between 250 and 300 on most of them. And then responses don't have a minimum, but you do have some requirements on what you have to do in the responses, and that's all in the discussion. So if you have questions, you know how to find me. Look at the syllabus, and it'll tell you how to find me if you forgot already. But certainly reach out if you have questions. With that, have a great week, and I look forward to speaking with you during the week sometime.